quite a while. Got a bunch of kids doing faith in style. They'll tell you that you're awesome and you're not alone. So let's start the show. Who knew Catholics could be so much fun? Greg and Jennifer and how faith is done. Screwing up and trying and forgiving. Adventures in imperfect living. Adventures in imperfect living.
Hey, greetings, folks. Welcome to another edition of the program. My name is Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
Coming up on the program, we have a special one for you. This is, we're going to be breaking ground in a few different ways since we've been doing the simulcast. I don't know what to call it when we're both doing the YouTube as well as the audio. Because our audio listeners, you're hearing the same thing. We're trying to keep it so that, while yes, we're doing a lot of visual flourishes. Right now, you're missing a visual flourish if you were watching.
Oh, man, I better make a note of that.
Visual flourishes are happening right now that if you're listening, you're still getting all the same content that you expect from the program. We haven't done any interviews or conversations with our friends in the Catholic world in a few months as we've been transitioning and getting used to doing some of the technology while also hosting the program. But Today, we finally break that ground and we break in the equipment to do our first video interview in a while. We've done them in the past, but it was really kind of we never did any sort of production work afterwards. It was always sort of like what Zoom recorded is what you got. I mean, that was pretty much it. When we interviewed Bishop Athanasius Schneider, I don't even think we released that video, did we? It was so awkward when we did things. It's like we did one with Scott Hahn. I know that's
right.
Out
it was
there.
just for our use and so that we could see him while talking to him, but it was never meant to share publicly. But do you still have those recordings in-house, like just on
with Bishop Schneider?
Yeah.
I got them somewhere.
Okay.
I got somewhere.
Cool.
Where I was wearing a tie, but in a jacket, but I was wearing shorts underneath. Underneath. Bishop Schneider had no idea. No idea I was doing that.
He didn't need to know.
But today we get the great pleasure of having Dr. Paul Thigpen on the program. He's written 60 books. We're actually going to talk to him about his 60th book today, which is this amazing one. It's The Life of St. Joseph as Seen by the Mystics. It's a new book from Tan Books, which is actually, it's a companion book. So this is the brand new one that just came out in the last year. And before that, you already had this. You sought this out yourself. This is The Life of Mary as Seen by the Mystics. This one was compiled by Raphael Brown. But both of these are available from Tan Books. And wanted to have Paul on in particular because the Feast of St. Joseph is coming up, and I sometimes struggle with him, but not with Paul, but with St. Joseph. And so I'm constantly trying to do better. And this book really does it. If you I've always wanted to be one of those people that has a relationship. Like last year, we had Father Donald Calloway on the program, and he did the book of consecration to St. Joseph. And a lot of people, myself included, said, I don't get it. Something is not there. This book really helps. And I think as you listen and watch this conversation with Dr. Paul Thigpen, you too are going to fall in greater love with him. Well, the bio, I think, kind of came out in the course of the conversation, but Dr. Paul Thigpen, I mean, we had an opportunity to interview him years ago at the Eucharistic Congress here in Atlanta, way back in 2006. We were helping the Archdiocese to do a podcast to get that started, and he was there that year as a speaker, and we had the opportunity to speak with him then. But he has done so much great work as a former editor for Tan Books. He has held positions teaching theology and history of theology at various universities all over the country. He's done a lot of amazing work, primarily in his writing, though, in helping people to dive more deeply into their faith. And he does it in particular in this new one. So we're super excited to share this conversation with you with Dr. Paul Thigpen on this book, The Life of St. Joseph as Seen by the Mystics. Here's Dr. Paul. So Paul, I think we're both native Georgia boys. I read you started in Savannah. I was a little bit all over in the Atlanta area, but do I got that correct? Are you Georgia boy at heart?
Oh, sure. Yeah, born, actually grew up on an island on the coast next to Georgia, so not far from the beach.
Nice.
And we have recently retired to the mountains, the other end of the state. Georgia's a big state. And people ask me, well, if you could live anywhere when you retire, why didn't you go back to the beach, which I love? I say, well, the beach will always be home, but when you grow up near the beach, you don't go to the beach for vacation, you go to the mountains. and now I'm on permanent vacation.
Oh, that's awesome.
So it feels real good.
Awesome.
So we're more in central Georgia, so our choices are endless. We if God ever were to see us to retire, we could go to the beach, we can go to the mountains, we can go wherever we want. So the mountains, I actually saw a little bit of a story, saw the conversation that you had with John Henry Weston on LifeSite News, which that's kind of interesting, by the way. You may have talked with one of our sons when you did that interview. So our son Walter is actually a video editor for LifeSite News and does a lot of John Henry Weston stuff. And so if you talked to a curly-headed kid on Zoom before you had that conversation with John Henry Weston, that was our boy.
That's our boy.
Okay, all right.
So he has so many people going through, and it's like, have you talked to so-and-so? Because, Dad, I don't know. I don't know who I talk to anymore. So you had that chance. But you were talking about your mountain house. And I loved the story that you told on that interview, and I was wondering if you could share the same kind of thing of how you discerned that property that you've ended up at, and what was St. Joseph's role in that whole thing?
Oh, golly. I don't often ask, put out a test, ask for a sign. In this case, our retirement location was pretty important. And St. Joseph, of course, is the patron saint of real estate. So he's helped us before when we had trouble finding a place that we needed to move. And so this time I talked first to Our Lady and then to St. Joseph and said, okay, we found a location that looks right. All the Zoom pictures, look good, Zillow pictures. And we're going to go up there now. And if you'd like to give me a sign, Blessed Mother, that would be lovely. And I know that the property's got 2 creeks on it. Wouldn't it be great to have a spring? Spring is a sign of purity. You gave St. Bernadette a spring. It's, the water comes up out of the ground, so you don't have to worry about it being contaminated from elsewhere. That's why it's a sign of purity. You don't have to, we'll make the most prudent decision, but that would be nice. And then St. Joseph, you can give any sign you want, if you want to. It's all right. If you don't, it's fine. But if I just need to know, I'm thick-headed. I need to know that it's a sign from St. Joe. And that was that. So we came up, drove up here, looked around. The house is looking great. Said, this is looking good. It's old. It's going to need work, but it's right for us. Went out into the yard, was walking the creeks, and was looking around. Blessed Mother, if you're going to do it, now's the time to do it. And sure enough, there's a little spring up. And so at that point, I said, okay, St. Joe, it's your turn if you're going to do it. And I remembered as we drove past the house, there was a beautiful mortared stone column, probably about 6 feet tall, and wasn't sure what it was because the mailboxes are down the road for the neighborhood, and thought I'd go over there and see what it's about. So walked over there, all the while talking to St. Joseph. Well, if you want to give me a sign, you can. It's okay. And then I walked around the side of the post, and mortared stones, but right in the middle of the mortared stone, there was a brick, and the brick was turned sideways so you could read the imprint on the top of it. And the brick said, big capital letters, St. Joe. Okay, I got it. This is literally a sign from St. Joe.
Did you ever find the origin of what was the previous homeowner?
I did. It was whoever made the stone post, one of the previous homeowners. It's an older house, so a number of homeowners probably put it in there. But I did some research, found out that down in Louisiana, there's a St. Joseph's foundry, and they put it on their bricks. Now they have to put it on the top because you don't want it on the side. So someone builds a house and it's got this lettering all over. So it has to be on the top, right? Like that. But this person had taken it purposely and turned it top out so that you could read it. So that's where it came from. And here's the amazing thing. Then not long ago, my daughter and her husband had to get a bigger house. Child number 6 came along and had to get a bigger house. They found a place and, did believe that St. Joseph had helped them find it, and kind of as a confirmation after the fact, third child was out digging in the dirt around behind this 100-year-old barn that's out there, and came back and said, "Look at this brick I found." And it's from the same foundry. It says St. Joe.
I thought you were going to tell me that he came in, he found a St. Joseph statue from the previous homeowner trying to sell the place. It's like, why was he upside down, backwards facing, whatever? It's like, so some people might be watching this right now or listening, and they've heard some weird things about St. Joseph and selling houses. and here you've written this book, Life of St. Joseph as Seen by the Mystics. I'm sure that they didn't specifically say anything at any point in time about burying St. Joseph upside down, facing the direction that you want to move to in any of their writings. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's about right. I don't think, especially some of them are pretty old. It's hundreds of years ago. So yeah.
I feel so weird about some of these St. Joseph house selling kits that you see. It's like I never know what to. It's like what do you do with those kinds of things? It's like just you pray to them and you ask. Now with the home selling thing, and this is minor stuff. So we've tried to sell houses many times, and people always said, get the statue or pray a novena to St. Joseph, which is what we tended to do. We'd pray a novena to St. Joseph and we'd ask, please help sell this house if it's the will of God. And quite honestly, the times that we did it, nothing happened, or the house sale fell apart or something else. And at my point of faith development at that time, I didn't know what to do with that. I just kind of felt like St. Joseph was kicking me out the door. Some people might ask prayers of saints or ask for intercessions and that kind of thing, particularly of St. Joseph or of our Blessed Mother, and they don't get those prayers answered. What would you say to those people that might feel a little bit discouraged if they tried once or twice or even 3 times and they just feel like, well, this is not the saint for me, obviously?
It's the same thing when we ask the Lord himself for something and it doesn't happen. And I've heard someone say, the Lord always answers our prayers, but sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, because this isn't best for you. I have a priest friend who says, and there's a third answer he gives, and when you ask for something, he says, "Are you kidding?" But I'll give an example. All right, from my daughters, that same thing. They were focused on a house that honestly, my wife and I were thinking, that's not the right house. It's not big enough. It's too expensive, all these things. But they were kind of desperate to get another place and asking St. Joseph for his help. And the thing was kind of came through, and we're still thinking, I don't know. And then right kind of at the last minute, the whole deal fell through. And for the kids especially, it was all not exactly a crisis of faith, but they're saying, but St. Joseph was going to help us. And I just said, remind them that if this didn't happen, God has something else and better in mind.
Yeah.
And sure enough, then this other house came along, and now they look back and say, of course, this was the right one. So I guess, sometimes later, you find out later, yes, this was better. That's why he said no. We may never, with some of those instances, we may never find out till heaven.
Yeah.
Where the Lord can stay, or the general judgment. That's one of the reasons for the judgment day, as we're told by the church, that God will show to each person all the factors of all the things he was working in together to make the world run and how his providence works, so that we will no longer have any reason to question his wisdom or his goodness or his faithfulness. We'll say, that's it. Now I know why you did that. Why you said no instead of yes.
Well, Dr. Paul, can you explain where this origin came from with St. Joseph and the petition for real estate transactions to go to this saint in particular? If it wasn't covered in the lives of the mystics, it seems like it's please tell me it's not 50 years old. That number is very popular.
Just arbitrarily, it's not 50 years old, is it?
What else happened 50 years ago?
I don't know when it started, but I think it's a pretty simple, extrapolation, if you will. He's the patron saint of the home, and our home here is dedicated to him. We have a sign out front now on that same post that I told you about, wooden sign, custom made, St. Joseph's Refuge. That's what we call it. We have images of him all through the home, and it's a place where people come to just get out in the woods and find a refuge. And so it's a very natural thing, I think, that people, now maybe not with business transactions, though I'm sure somebody appealed to him for that by extension. Seems to me a very natural thing, that if he's the patron saint of the home, that St. Joseph was the one who would have always had to arrange for a home for the Holy Family, whether it was in Bethlehem or whether it was in Nazareth or whether it was in Egypt, wherever they were, that he knows something about finding homes for a family.
Okay, so here's another question. Yeah. Would you ever recommend to anyone in your family to buy one of those little home kits? Would you ever say, bury St. Joseph in the ground, knowing what you know?
I like to think of, I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. And of course, there was a time when anything kind of with sacramental reality was just foreign to me. And why would you do that? Why would you light a votive candle when you pray? Why would you use holy water and stuff?
Yeah, that's good.
And I like to say that for some folks, it's a concrete act of devotion where you're not just saying something, you do something that symbolically represents something important. And so I could see someone at least putting a statue out, or even if you bury it because you're trying to connect it to the land. The upside down thing has never made any sense to me, but okay. As long as someone's not doing disrespectfully or even superstitiously, where this is going to work like a magic charm. Instead, as you know, to pray while you do it, to put the statue out, or whatever, and say, Saint Joseph, this is my concrete act of devotion, just like lighting a votive candle, just like having a statue of the Holy Infant of Prague and putting a quarter under it. That's not magic. It's no. But it is a concrete sign of devotion. This quarter represents all that I have, Lord, putting it under your feet, and it all belongs to you. So there are a lot of, what would you call them, folk customs like that don't really bother me unless people really get superstitious about it.
I'm sure you've heard the story about the guy who wanted to sell his house. Everyone told him, go get the St. Joseph statue and bury it. He went and bought one of these things, buried it in his yard, pointed in the direction that he wanted to go. It's buried. He's waiting. Days, weeks, months pass. The house doesn't sell. He gets so frustrated. He goes outside and he digs up the St. Joseph statue and he throws it in the trash. And then the next day, the local garbage dump sold.
That's about right. I can see that.
So you mentioned being a convert, Paul. You converted to the church back in back in '93. I had to throw that. It was so apropos while we were talking about that. Yeah. You converted back in '93. Tell us about your whole conversion. Why Catholicism?
Oh, wow. Let me see if I can make this short. I've written a long piece about it in the book Surprised by Truth. The first of those by Pat Madrid, edited by Pat Madrid. The first chapter of the first book's my story. And I could write a lot more, but I had kind of two conversions. I was raised in a nominal Presbyterian home. At the age of 12, was reading some Enlightenment skeptics like Voltaire and others. My teacher gave me some stuff to read. Became an atheist at 12, and then was an atheist for 6 years. The age of 18, had a dramatic conversion experience. I'd been fooling around with the occult, not realizing spiritual realities were real. Thinking it was just powers of the human mind that were hidden. Had some very clear encounters with demonic powers that showed me that my nice little tidy materialist vision of the world was not adequate. And but so within a short time after that, became a convinced Christian, was evangelical, and eventually ended up getting working on a PhD, master's and PhD in church history, and as St. John Newman said, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. That really happened to me. I still, in my very first semester, I took an entire course on St. Augustine, who I love dearly. And oh my goodness, that just changed so much for me.
When you were studying towards your doctorate, or was that still in undergrad?
Well, I had an undergrad degree in religious studies, and I'd started studying church history then, but just because of the course offerings at the time, I didn't get to study much in the early church. A lot of it was medieval or Reformation or American church history. So got into the fathers really deeply in my grad program right away with St. Augustine and others. And I thought, oh my goodness, the early church was Catholic, I mean, St. Ignatius of Antioch, and he's talking about the Eucharist as the very body and blood that was on the cross, and where the bishop is, there's the church, and other things. And I'm saying, St. Ignatius got his faith from the apostles directly, Peter and Andrew, most likely they're in Antioch. If he got it wrong, then nobody has any chance of getting it right. And look, he was Catholic. He even used the word Catholic to speak of the church. So
when you
that was the beginning of a journey.
When you came in then, going through all this through your studies, where were you in family life at this point? Were you married with kids?
Yes, married. By the time I came in with two children, and that was an adventure in itself. I had the leisure every day in grad school to be studying the church fathers and all these things, and my mind was being converted. My wife was taking care of the kids, and she was the manager of the graduate student housing apartments that we lived in. So she was doing all these other things, and she wasn't reading Augustine. She wasn't reading the others. And it really took a couple of years. I think I was ready probably a couple of years before she was. But the Lord finally got convinced her as well. So the whole family did come in together. We had 2 kids.
And when you came in, did you have an idea, more than a superficial idea of St. Joseph? Did St. Joseph play a role, do you think, in your conversion?
Well, I'll put it this way. He, by that time, he had become important enough to me that when I had to choose a confirmation saint, my first thought was St. Augustine. And I got to thinking about St. Joseph, and I said, I'll be okay as a theologian, but I really need help as a husband and father. I need St. Joseph. He's the patron of them. And so he's been my personal patron ever since then.
What were some of those struggles that you endured that led you to St. Joseph, that to formulate that opinion of him needing help as a husband and father? What were some of those struggles at the time?
Well, one of them was that up until the very last minute, my wife wasn't going to be coming into the church. And that was a last minute decision. And we were in a parish at that point parish boundaries in Central Florida, a small town. I won't mention the parish, that had a very minimal RCA program. It was 6 weeks long.
Wow. That's
one of the weeks.
All of Catholicism?
For the whole thing, yeah. And basically learned Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, which I already knew. Yeah. And 1 week, the priest was teaching it, was sick and couldn't take it. He asked me to teach the class. And I'm supposed to be here learning this.
You're ready
at the end of the very last class,
Wow.
He comes up to me and says, Lisa had been coming along, but she said, can be no pressure on, Lisa's my wife, no pressure on my becoming Catholic. I'll just sit and listen. I said, that's great. And the priest knew that. After the last class, he comes up to me and says, Paul, are you ready? And I said, I'm so ready. And he turns to her and says, what about you? And she says, I am too. I just hit my jaw at the ground. I had no idea at that point. And so it was a beautiful thing. It was a really beautiful thing. But I had been a pastor before that. This has meant giving up my ordination. By that time, I wasn't pastoring. I was doing other things. And I think in part, I'd been kind of led to go that way, feeling that I was heading this direction.
Were you married when you were a pastor?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this would have been a significant change for your wife. It's not just a matter of like, we're going to go to a different church. It's like everything changed if she had seen you working in that capacity. Yeah.
And like I said, I had moved on from that church to do some, I guess it was probably editing work at that time. I don't even remember where I was, but so that if I did go that direction, I wouldn't be standing up in the pulpit one day. And I was an associate pastor, not senior pastor, but and just standing up in the pulpit one day and say, hey guys, I'm becoming Catholic, would have just caused chaos. And I was deeply embedded there, had a lot of dear friends. So we were actually in another town, Central Florida, by the time that happened. So, word still got back. It was difficult, but still so much of our identity. We met in the church, the church, the Protestant church we were in. Obviously, we had developed our friendship there. We'd always go to church every Sunday morning. Not to be in the same place on Sunday morning would have felt like a spiritual divorce to it.
Ooh, wow. Yeah. That's a really interesting dynamic when you look at it through that lens.
Well, let's talk about St. Joseph beyond the real estate market and more how he applies in our lives and how he affects the entire church. Is that one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I thought about how do I ask this so it's not kind of confusing. I want to talk about the book itself, the life of St. Joseph as seen by the mystics. But again, so here you're a convert. If someone came up and they're curious about the faith and they said, I get this part of the church teachings, I understand this part, but I don't get St. Joseph. I see him in the Bible. He was the guardian of Jesus. Why does he matter? Why do you care about him? How would you describe St. Joseph and the importance of St. Joseph, sort of in that nutshell version of him to someone who might be asking?
Yeah, typically the way I would do it, because so much of what's in this book and other books depends on one basic thing, and that is, and that would be the answer to this question. If God's going to send and trust his only son into the world, it's the same with Mary, into the world, and give him a human mother, what kind of woman would that have to be? What kind of woman would he choose? We could choose any woman in all of history. What kind of woman would that be? And how would he prepare her? And then a similar question for St. Joseph. He could have entrusted Mary and the child Jesus to any man at any time in history. He could have chosen any time. If he chose Joseph to be the guardian of his son, and of his son's mother. What kind of man must he have been? And all the rest flows from that.
So when we look at what the mystics say, and because we just know this high level, so he was an honorable man. Scripture tells us that. He's in the dream after he was told, take Mary as your wife, and he did that, and he cared for the child. And when he was told to go to Egypt, he went to Egypt, and he did all the right things. But this idea of his relationship, it's hard to, outside of our own imaginations, to envision the role he actually played. How does this book help us to see it? And then I'll ask a second part on top of it. How do we know that we can trust that vision if it didn't come from Scripture?
Good. Well, we'll answer the second part first. How about that?
Yeah.
The church is very clear that what it calls public revelation ended with the apostles, and that is the deposit of faith, as the church calls it, given to us by Christ through the apostles. That is in Scripture and in definitive sacred tradition, and as interpreted by the magisterium of the church and its definitive definitions. And that won't change, and that won't be added to. But that from time to time, God does give a private revelation to an individual, a group of individuals, and because he wants to help us understand the public revelation better or apply it better to our lives. But when he does that, the church makes it very clear, even then, even if the church itself should look at the private revelation and say there's nothing in this contrary to faith and morals, and we can even recommend it as a good thing devotionally, even then the church says, but no Catholic is obligated to accept it. You certainly don't put it on the same level as Scripture or the sacred tradition, magisterial decision. You don't do that. And in fact, you don't even have to accept it. You're not obligated to accept it. But the church, with certain ones, will recommend that it be accepted. So these are the kinds of visions that we have here. And many of them they've all, in some ways, stood the test of time. You know that they're not, the church would say, not only do you not take them as gospel, but you don't even take them necessarily as history or science. That, yes, certain things described in here may very well have been historical things, but you can't just assume that. And one of the ways you know that is when you, for instance, I've got 5 mystics that I drew from here. Mm-hmm. When you start looking at their visions, you find out that they differ in certain very important matters, not just details. So, for instance, one of the mystics in her visions, she sees Mary's parents, Anna and Joachim, have both died by the time she's betrothed to Joseph. One of the other mystics sees that Joachim had died, but that Anna lived on, remarried, and then used her wealth and sacrifice of her goods and time and energy to help care for the Holy Family when it was young. Now that's not a small detail that you could easily reconcile. They're two very different things, and they affect all kinds of things. So you look at that and you say, okay, that's true. Then it's not. You can't take it as history. I like to say it's more like sacred drama. That what God gave, and there are lots of mystical theologians who have written about this, that God, it's as if God has a certain spiritual lesson he wants you to learn through these visions. And it can be learned with all the differences and details that way. And that when God paints the pictures in these visions, he paints with a broad brush, and he even uses artistic liberty at some point to make the details different, to maybe make this brighter and that darker, for the contrast. And so it's like God is an artist in these, and because they don't agree doesn't mean we throw them out the window. That's only if we're looking for the wrong thing, if we're looking for a strict historical account. But so I like to say sacred drama. So, for instance, Mel Gibson's movie Passion of the Christ. Most of you probably, the audience has probably seen it. Everybody knows that he had to take artistic license in that to kind of fill in a lot of the scenes, and tried to do it in a very devout way, something that wouldn't be contrary to faith or morals. And as a matter of fact, 2 of the mystics that I draw from here are the source of certain scenes he has in that movie. He knew these mystics, and he was drawing from them.
I knew
So
Catherine
that beautiful-
Emmerich. Who was the other mystic that he drew from?
Mary de Agreda.
Oh,
Maria
okay.
de Agreda.
Okay, that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
That makes sense.
And so, for instance, there's that beautiful scene in the movie has been scourged and taken away. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of our Lord, they're out. They've got these white linens, and they're out there trying desperately to clean up the precious blood on the stones because it is so precious. And then another woman comes out and starts to help them. And that's Claudia, according to tradition, Pontius Pilate's wife, who, according to tradition, actually became a Christian. She's the one who had the dream and told Pontius, don't have anything to do with this man. I've had a dream about him. That scene is very powerful, very beautiful. If nothing else, it touches you that they're understanding how precious the blood of Jesus is. So would someone say, oh, but that's not historical, throw it out, or that, undermines the whole story? No, it brings out the meanings of the story. So it's a similar kind of thing. It's almost like a sacred drama, that we don't take it as straight history or science, but we do take it as God's kind of dramatic presentation to bring out, if he emphasizes certain details here, and if he supplies, in the visionary's imagination, certain things there, it doesn't have to be total history for it to be beautiful and powerful, life-changing for us. And it was for me, for sure.
And I would think, as the compiler of these 5 different mystics, that you had to also paint with a bit of a broad brush as well to combine these stories and pick and choose which ones go into it. What was that process like for you as a writer?
Yeah, that is an important point. A lot of folks might think, if they heard this, that I was kind of say, and here's what Anne Catherine Emmerich saw, and then here's what Mary of Agreda saw, and then here's, but it's, the way I did it was to weave passages from the different mystics together into a single narrative so that it reads kind of like a biographical novel. And that also meant some of the language, like you would say, that the mystic would say, and then I saw this, and I wondered what that was, but then this angel told me. So I had to change all that into just writing it, like a biography and telling the story. Had to do those things. I had to, when there were contradictions, I had to kind of choose one or the other. Contradictions maybe is the right word, but differences in how they approached it. Had to choose one or the other. Originally, I'd been asked to, why don't you footnote the part from everything, but there were sentences that actually had elements from several coming together. The language was usually antique. I had to update the language. In the case of one of the mystics, all I could find was the original text in 16th century Spanish. My Spanish is adequate, but it's certainly not 16th century. So, but I translated it, with the help of the Lord. So it'd be kind of like a Spanish speaker today trying to translate a King James Bible.
Wow.
It's a similar kind of thing. So there was a lot of work in it, a lot of prayer in it. Had to, what's another thing? Okay, it's kind of funny. I really want men as well as women to be reading this. I think it's probably more natural in certain ways. I'm not trying to be sexist, but for women to read the visionaries, and all the visionaries themselves cited were women. But I want men to be reading this about St. Joseph. And sometimes there's kind of a typical difference between what a woman would want to see and what a man would want to see. So I smile when I say this. It's just makes me think of my wife and my mother and others, that there would be scenes where they would describe in great detail the clothes that everybody in a scene was wearing and all the different colors and the robes and the things like that and the buttons and those things. And I'm thinking, no guy is going to run and read all this. There are not many. I mean, when the wise men came and they brought their stuff, as one of them called it, and I realized, okay, Stoffe is German for, we translate as stuff, but it actually means fabric. And our word stuff used to mean fabric. So he's talking about the fabrics and describing all these beautiful fabrics they brought and all these kinds of things and the decorations on the camels. And so, okay, I really need to condense that a little bit. We got to focus on the action here, That's
Get to the point.
That's what guys want, is going to see the action. Oh, and especially because the story.
As we're having an interview right now with 2 guys who are both wearing like light colored button down shirts. It's about the most boring thing in the world for us to wear. But here we are. And then, Jennifer's all nice with her hair's done and her beautiful sweater and everything. Yeah, it's like, we're St. Joseph's.
So I'm not trying to be sexist. I know these are just generalities, but but so that some of that stuff I would have to condense a lot, and others then I would always try to focus on the action. And because most of the stories, all except one, were really focused on the life of Mary, and I was just pulling out the stuff that necessarily involved Joseph because she's central to his life and he to hers. That because of that, I had to make sure that if I had a passage that didn't mention Joseph, for a few paragraphs, that there's some good reason for it, and then he would come back in. Because in these passages, you'd often have doing things where Joseph is not involved; he's out of town or whatever. So I had to also make sure I was pulling out the passages that would illustrate the kind of man Joseph is. That was always the thing I wanted to go back to. How does this action, these words, this disposition, this attitude reveal his character? And there was so much that did reveal his character. It was beautiful.
What surprised you the most? I'm sure there were, as you were reading and going through what all the mystics have revealed, was there any facets of St. Joseph's life, either his early life, that really impressed you and left a big impression on your life?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Folks have made the parallel between the Joseph of the Old Testament and Joseph of the New Testament before. And usually they would focus on things like that. The Joseph of the Old Testament was, helped to bring bread to his people, was instrumental in that. And St. Joseph in the New Testament, the same, the bread of life, Jesus. But in what they seem to see, the mystics, were other things that once you think about it, there are parallels. So for instance, that Joseph had brothers and they didn't like him.
Yeah.
And they would persecute him in certain ways. And boy, right there, you say, oh, I see that parallel.
I'm missing it. Tell me the parallel. What's the other?
Okay,
half?
I'm sorry. So in the Old Testament, Joseph, you remember his brothers were jealous of him and didn't like him, and then sold him into slavery. So in the New Testament, what you're seeing as they reveal in the life of early Joseph is that he also has brothers, and they don't like him, and they mistreat him, and they persecute him.
I didn't know that.
The mystics are telling us this.
The mystics are saying that, right? Now, again, we don't take it as history. But that's one of the things that kind of surprised me is that in what they were seeing, there were even more parallels like that.
Oh, fascinating.
Wow. Did he have a brightly colored coat? Made by his dad.
He didn't wear anything but brown robes. That's all he wore.
Actually, one of the mystics, of course, had to describe his wedding garments. So it was very beautiful, and but again, because that was just so important to them, those kinds of things. But he it was more not so much surprising as it was just things that I would go, oh yeah, that would have been the case, wouldn't it? And so, for instance, one of the things I love most is when he gets the dream, take the child and his mother, get out of here. Herod wants to kill the boy, go to Egypt. He wakes up, and if the way it's worded there in the Gospel of Matthew, it sounds like it was immediate. It's as if he said, yes, sir, gets up in the middle of the night, packs things, prepares them, and goes. And this is the kind of thing I was talking about before, where we know so little from Scripture, but what we do know allows us to ask the question, what sort of man would be like this? What sort of man would it take to hear the dream, get up in the middle of the night, say, yes, sir, knowing, and do it, knowing that his tools of his trade are probably still back in Nazareth. He almost certainly doesn't speak Egyptian. He doesn't know Egypt. He has no work waiting for him there. He knows that the people are pagan and they're going to dislike him because they're Jewish. He knows that the road there is difficult, that it's dangerous, that there are robbers and thieves, that there are probably, vipers and all kinds of other things, and how difficult it's going to be on the mother and the child. What kind of man would it take, in light of all that, to still say, yes, sir, I'm going right now? What kind of faith and trust, what kind of courage, what kind of fortitude would it take in a man to be like that? And then they paint the picture so beautifully with all these details of what they encounter on the way to Egypt. That just paints, in such a vivid way what the dangers were and what they were encountering, and how both Joseph's faith and Our Lady's faith and fortitude, but also God's special graces along the way, would help them to do what God had called them to do. And of course, that's one of the lessons that you apply from his life. That when God says do it, you obey and you trust him to make up the difference when you're lacking. whatever it is you're lacking.
The
That's beautiful.
The last chapter that you wrote was about special virtues, graces, and glories. Can you talk about these a little bit and explain to our audience that these special virtues, graces, glories associated with St. Joseph are these things that can also come alive through him in our own lives?
Yes, I need to read some of that. I would love to read some aloud. It's so beautiful. It says that Joseph could not have endured seeing Jesus' crucifixion because of his great love for him. It would have just crushed him so terribly. A lot of people have wondered, why didn't God allow Joseph to live through Jesus' earthly lifetime the way he did with Mary? But another one of the things kind of surprising for me, but just made so much sense, was in the section on his death and the last years leading up to his death, how they seem to agree that that Joseph didn't die of whatever illness or old age finally would seem to us to have taken it, that he died of love for our Lord, that all of his life, because he had this exquisite, great love for Jesus, that it would have consumed him long before if God hadn't given him a special grace to hold his body and soul together, because the soul was just bursting with love for Jesus. And that when the time came and God knew it was time, then he withdrew that special grace, and the consuming love inside Joseph begins to take over everything until it finally breaks his bond with his body. And
That's
sorry
powerful.
to choke up thinking about it. It is powerful.
Wow.
Well, and that makes sense, going back to one of the earlier chapters when you were describing even Joseph's struggle with being Jesus's father, like in the wood shop or whatever, and him struggling with the idea that he was given the responsibility of telling God what to do. Go here, go there, go do that, and praying for that, please take that away. But it's like, no, I need you to have this responsibility. And then you think about just that one line in Scripture of finding the child Jesus in the temple. Jesus went back and was obedient to them, and how that all those things played together. But when I read that part about Joseph struggling, I totally could believe that if he understood who he was dealing with. It's like, I don't. You do whatever you want, Jesus. I'll let me get that hammer. Let me get that nail.
You're the creator. I'm just a creature. But I mean, the same thing with Mary. This beautiful scene. Soon after when they're living under the same roof, and the way they described it was that the mystics, that there was a custom at the time where the first part of the marriage, the husband and wife, newlyweds, were supposed to study each other carefully to learn how best to live with each other and to care for each other. Beautiful thought. And that the kind of awkwardness of it almost, because she's saying, he's my husband. I'll defer to him in the ways I should as a wife. And he's saying, she's the mother of God. I've got to defer to her. And they're kind of saying, no, you go first, that kind of thing. I mean, even when they're going to Bethlehem, it's almost comical that there's a scene where Mary loves Joseph so much that she doesn't want to be riding on the donkey the whole time. She wants him to ride so he can rest a little. And so she insists, and he can't say no. So he lets her get off, but instead of riding, he walks with her so that she can have her request that she's not riding all the time. And she can show her love, but then he shows his love and care by saying, I'll walk with you while we do this. Beautiful things like that. So his relationship with her, but also with Jesus, and how little Jesus would pick up a tool and do something with it. And when he put it down, Joseph would take it and give it a kiss. The customers would come in, and when Jesus got old enough, they'd say, this boy's really smart. This boy, he was in the temple doing it. He needs to be a rabbi. Why are you letting him in your shop? Why are you making him work in your shop? You're doing an injustice to him. And he knows why he's doing it. This is what he's supposed to do, but he can't tell them. It's not Jesus' time to be revealed yet. He can't say to them, he's supposed to be with me because he's the Son of God, and he doesn't need a rabbi. I mean, you remember later in Jesus' life when they say, hey, who is your teacher? Who's your rabbi? We know who our rabbi was. And he says, God the Father is my rabbi. He was not supposed to go study with a rabbi because there's an important point that they may have gotten their traditions from other people, but he got it straight from God. So he couldn't do that. And yet he couldn't tell them. Joseph couldn't tell them that. And others would, come in and just make all these comments and try to make him feel awful that he wasn't treating Jesus right. And yet he had this great, just like Mary, had this great secret that he had to ponder and keep inside without spilling it out to others, and just bear with the reproach, just like Mary did, and just like our Lord, of course, did.
Well, in addition to having apparently the great capacity to bear all things with great patience, as he clearly was able to do, how would you see or describe his temperament, his personality? I've read a little bit of The Mystical City of God and understood that the way that Sister Mary explained the temperaments of Mary was that it was perfect. It was in perfect harmony to the four bodily humors. Did you come across any information in your research that sort of fleshed out a little bit of what St. Joseph's temperament was like? Was it also perfect like Mary's?
Never have that kind of statement that I read anywhere. You have to kind of read between. You have to read what he says and does, and draw conclusions from there. I would say, depending on which one of the temperament categories you want to use, one of the categories is somebody who's kind of out in front. I love the disc. I don't know if you ever had the disc test for personality, and one of them, the high I, is the person who's the influencer and likes to be out front in an audience and stuff like that. Definitely not that. Okay, he was more the one who came alongside quietly, which in that test would be the S. The S category. He would come alongside quietly. That's why we never even have a word in Scripture from him. He comes alongside Mary. He comes alongside Jesus. Has Jesus at his side as a boy, and yet in some ways the strength of in that test, what would be the D, the dominant thing. Not that he would dominate, but that he had to have the strength of a very strong temperament in the way that when he knew something was right, he did it no matter what. Which sometimes some of the other temperaments, if they might have a little trouble doing that. But I don't know if I'm making much sense. But just the kind of thing I'm seeing from what he did, I would say especially that he was the type that would, in humility, he would come alongside. He didn't have to be out in front. He didn't have to be the story. He just was the one who wanted to support and serve. And he had a servant's heart. That's Jesus again and again, the heart of a servant.
Without going into a whole lot, and it's beyond the real estate thing, but I've talked about this on our program in the past. I've struggled in developing a relationship with St. Joseph for various reasons. And I'm just very appreciative of this book that you've compiled using these mystics, because I think what was missing was a broader picture that I needed to see that man who cared and loved Jesus so much. And that's what I can relate to. And I've read so many other works and other things about St. Joseph, and I get it. He loves them. Fine. It's kind of a high level. That's what you always get from these books. But diving into it and seeing it come alive in the way that you did in this book, I genuinely appreciate what you've done, Paul. And it's helped me. And especially as we're approaching St. Joseph's feast day, I always get a little anxious around this time of the year, to be honest. It's like leading up to St. Joseph's feast day, and people are like, oh, St. Joseph, and we're going to have a St. Joseph's table. And I'm like, I struggle. But I want to overcome that. I feel drawn to him, and yet at the same time intimidated. And so I hope other people that might have that same level of anxiousness as I do would pick up this book and actually maybe have their life changed for the good as a result of it. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for sharing these stories with us. And it was just, let's not wait, 17 years until we talk again. I actually, Paul, I'm embarrassed to say, I actually saw you, I don't know, it was about 3 or 4 years ago. We went to, it was the first TLM Mass being offered at
Our Lady of the Mountains.
Our Lady of the Mountains. Okay. And we were
Oh,
in
yeah.
the narthex, and you were walking by, and I hadn't seen you, since 2006 at the Eucharistic Congress, and I was like, wait, and I had to stop and think was that Paul? It's like, then you were gone. You started talking to someone else. Never saw you again. I'm like, well, I saw him. So hi, Paul.
And the thing we really did, we don't live too far away. So
No.
we did do this for often. Yeah.
So anyway, but I remember seeing you there that night, and I'm sure our paths will cross again sometime soon. And just it was a pleasure having you on the program, and I hope that people go get the Life of St. Joseph as seen by the mystics, and we'll put links to it on our show notes. You can get it from Tan Books, wherever you get your favorite Catholic books. Paul, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. God bless you and all your listeners.
I'm not just blowing smoke.
Are you sure?
That really, wait a minute. No, I'm not blowing smoke. That made a difference to me. That conversation and this book is making a difference. And
Good.
I
Good.
greatly do appreciate the work. I could not imagine taking works of mystics, and in particular what he said with taking Spanish language and translating that and cobbling all that together. And one question I didn't ask him, I wish I had. How long did this particular project take? Because sometimes, you can write a book in a couple of months. A good book, an in-depth book, if you've been taking notes for a while and that kind of thing. I have no idea how long a project like this would have taken, but it's a labor of love. You could tell of his love for St. Joseph. And so hopefully it's something that is resonating with you. But thank you for hanging out with us on this program.
Well, one of the takeaways I think I will treasure in my heart.
I was going to wrap up. You're going to take away takeaways now?
One little thing I just want to say, because I really enjoyed.
This is one of those things where ESP of marriage, it didn't work. You just saw it break down right here. I was going in one direction. She's going in another.
Whoop, let's go back this way.
I'm talking about just plain shirts. She wants to talk about the buttons.
No. What I want to talk about was this idea that, and I think it was you who actually appreciated this comment that Dr. Paul made, because Dr. Paul Thigpen was saying that all St. Joseph did was love Mary and Jesus. He was so devoted to them that's something that you can relate to personally, because that's what you, at this point in your life, you're really all in on this. I want to love Mary and Jesus very intensely. Well, then St. Joseph is your guy. He did that, fully human, and did it.
That answer, right? That was the answer and the problem, because the idea is I want to keep my focus on Mary and Joseph, and I have felt historically
on Mary and Joseph.
Mary and Jesus.
Right.
Thank you. I have felt historically that I was supposed to somehow love Joseph as much as them, and I don't know how to do that. But I don't feel like after this conversation, after this book, I don't feel like that's what I'm being asked to do. St. Joseph is a model for how to love them.
Yeah, we got to copy him.
And he doesn't, just like Mary doesn't really want the love either. She wants us to give it all to Jesus, but she helps us to go in that. Well, Joseph helps us to understand how better to serve Mary and Jesus. And that resonates with me, that I want to be able to do that more. So thank you. Thank you for hanging out with us. Thank you to all of you who are supporting Rosary Army's Apostolate. Right now, of course, we need a lot of help. If you go over to rosaryarmy.com/donate, your tax-deductible donation can go a long way in helping us to continue doing not only this work, but all the work of Rosary Army, including the development of our School of Mary initiative. We're still making, we're going to talk about that. We are making progress on our total consecration program. It's going to be so exciting to be able to share this with so many of you, particularly those of you who have never gone through it before because you were intimidated. Again, here I was intimidated about St. Joseph. If you've ever been intimidated by the idea of total consecration, what we're developing, I think, is going to make a huge difference in you wanting to live even more for Jesus. I
had a revelation, Greg, about total consecration and who it's for.
Okay.
Yes. I now know who it's for.
Is it for us? All over again?
It's kind of for everybody, especially if you love Mary and you love the Rosary, then consecration is for you.
You have to do it.
You have to do it. You don't have to know all this stuff beforehand. If you love Mary,
what if you struggle with Mary?
The Rosary,
what if you struggle with the Rosary?
You can go in and just appreciate these prayers. At its heart, you're learning more about who she is, who Christ is, who you are, and praying your way through it. And it's just going to be amazing. It's for everyone. It's for everyone. It's not a niche group of Catholicism. It's for all people.
So if you would, please keep us in your prayers and be assured that we are keeping you in ours. We're so grateful for the time that you spend with us here each and every single week. If you want to send feedback to the program, you can either record video or audio, and you can upload that by going over to rosaryarmy.com.wetransfer.com. That's the easiest way to do it because you can upload large files to us. Keep your feedback, your video and your audio 2 minutes or less. I'd really appreciate it. It makes it easier for us to share it without having to do any editing or cutting it down for time. If you want to go beyond 2 minutes, then perhaps you need to start your own podcast. But if you want to share your feedback on our program, then do it that way. And we're glad to share it and glad to respond if you have questions. Video and audio questions are always awesome because then we can see your beautiful face, hear your gorgeous voices, and respond directly here on the program. But that's it for now. Thanks so much again to Dr. Paul Thigpen for being on the program. Pray your rosary today. Make sure that you're building up that daily habit. Mary told you to do it, so do it.
Do whatever it takes to be holy.
Talk to you soon, folks. God bless.
Bye.